All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Security researcher Joe Slowik is with me, and you're a repeat offender here on the podcast.
I am. Thanks for having me back. It means it must not have been too bad the first time around.
No, not at all. It was great. It's nice to do these face-to-face anyway. But.
Exactly.
So, obviously, here at RSA, how's the show going for you?
Show's going great. Certainly every year I think has a theme, and I think we found out the theme this year is, big surprise, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
But there's a lot going on in the space, and it's been pretty exciting to see it unfold over the past week with 30,000 of my closest friends.
So I know you did a talk this week, kind of a unique spin on critical infrastructure and kind of how we're assessing the state of things, just kind of high level. Give me the elevator pitch on your talk.
Yeah, so the elevator pitch for the talk is that critical infrastructure defense is a interesting tension between individual organizations that operate in critical spaces are incentivized to view themselves as being the most important thing that's going on. Like defending my own organization is the most important thing. But if we take a step up in a layer of abstraction to, say, a national government or similar, then not everything can be critical, otherwise nothing is.
Right.
So how do we start prioritizing response and resources to start ensuring that we're getting the maximum return on investment in terms of defensive resources, but also at the same time acknowledging the ethical dilemma that we can't just leave some entities behind because they're not the most important.
Right.
And so how do we balance those tensions? And there might not be a really good way of balancing them, but even just acknowledging that disconnect exists, I think is important to start solving the issue.
I bet you might have ruffled some feathers too.
I hope not. The idea wasn't to try and call people out as doing something wrong or otherwise, but rather just to get people to start realizing that, hey, everyone wants everything to be defended. We all want clean water. We all want reliable power, etc. But spread resources too thin across too many entities, and it starts to become too diffuse to have an impact anymore.
It's our fault in security, though. We're filthy with acronyms and, and little cliches, and then everybody has this self-importance. And I mean, every business wants to protect themselves, obviously. But.
Right. Yeah, and there's incentivization around this as well. But one of the inspiring items behind this is that for some of your listeners who are already familiar with it, and for others who are not, the DHS within the United States has defined critical infrastructure as encompassing 16 sectors for quite some time. And you start digging into those 16 sectors and you think about it, it's like, well, this is basically everything anyway. So if those are all the critical things and everything is critical, then what is most important of the things that are already critical, and really trying to pick that apart. So again, not saying that DHS is wrong, but really trying to just argue that we need to think about this a little harder and then start prioritizing among things if we really want to have a impact or the impact that we desire.
What do you think's behind this kind of approach, this mindset, whatever it is?
Well, I think it's the same sort of mindset we have in security, where no one wants to be the person who missed something. Yeah. And so it's a classic scope creep issue where it's like, okay, well, electric utilities are important. I was like, well, so are hospitals. And it's like, well, in order for hospitals to function, you need clean water. Well, and then the people who are providing the materials that are used in hospitals and manufacturing are important too. And all these other things start piling on one another that it becomes very difficult to say, stop. Like this is not as significant anymore, because no one wants to be the person whose name goes under the decision that I said that this organization wasn't significant and something bad happens as a result.
And do you think that impedes anything in terms of either resource allocation or prioritization or, understanding attacker motives, anything like that?
I think the real areas of concern are twofold. One is at the macro level of resource allocation and need identification of, okay, what is most important or simply important if I'm talking about allocation of scarce resources, whether public sector or even private sector, to maintain continuity of the economy, continuity of government and similar. What do I basically need in order to make that happen? So that's the macro side. And then on the micro side, for individual organizations, an actual realistic understanding of what can I genuinely anticipate in terms of support and guidance from higher level authorities if things hit the fan. Because I don't think we've been as honest with organizations where it's like, okay, CISA does the best job that it can in the U.S. We have national level certs in other countries the same. They can't respond to everything. And even from a private sector perspective, yes, I have a incident response retainer with a very impressive sounding firm. If things start happening at a level of a Volt Typhoon degree of disruption, do those firms have enough resources to respond to everyone at once? Probably not.
Yeah.
So who gets their first bite at the apple in these sorts of circumstances, and is that communicated so that organizations that may be left behind at least know that and can plan appropriately in terms of things like business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning in the physical space and the administrative space, so that operations will be severely degraded, but they might still at least be available to some extent instead of being completely shut down because expectations didn't match with reality.
And do you think that like there's a real government kind of prioritization of these sectors, or?
To a degree, I would imagine there has to be.
Yeah.
I think where things get interesting is that to what degree is that communicated to stakeholders? Now, and I made this clear in my presentation earlier this week at RSA, I never expect that list, nor should it ever become public for a variety of reasons.
Right.
But some way of taking a hard-nosed approach to like, hey, you know what, this is where you fall based on the overall scheme of things. Therefore, plan appropriately for what resources may be available to you in the event of a disruptive incident in the cyber landscape that impedes or impairs the delivery of services.
I can see how some people in the moment would get a little panicked, though. It's like, wait a minute, where's mine?
Exactly. And, it's a fair assessment because we like to think that for when it comes to the provision of public goods, like I make this analogy all the time. We don't expect any organization in the United States, to use that as our specific example here, to defend themselves against an ICBM attack from the Russian Federation. That's unrealistic, and no one's going to do that. Missile defense is delegated to national level military defense. Yet, in the cyber landscape, we have effectively, and if you look at some of the recent executive orders coming out of the current administration, maybe even pushing more aggressively to sort of down selecting or pushing response closer to the local level, where resourcing is very interesting, if not even existent in some cases. And what does that mean for how it is we're able to do these sorts of actions? And I think that some folks expect, like, well, if something really bad happens, like the FBI will show up, or DHS will show up, or Cybercom will show up.
Will they?
Right. And having some clear expectations, like, you know what, in a really bad situation, they're not. And so how are we positioned to respond from our own organization standpoint in that circumstance in order to make sure we're doing the best that we can to maintain services to our customer and service base?
Yeah. Is the problem in the word critical? Is there, you need a better definition or a better word?
So that was the kickoff of my presentation, that taking an actual look at and defining critical would be key. And then there's the classic Incredibles syndrome meme, like, if everyone's super, no one is. Well, if everything's critical, then nothing really is at the end of the day, because you have to make some prioritization from that. But then as we take a step back and look at things like, again, defining the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, or the CERCIA legislation on incident response reporting that was passed a few years ago, is supposed to come into effect next year. We'll see in the current environment if that actually happens. But looking at the CERCIA definitions of criticality and covered entities, they're fairly broad, fairly quickly in terms of what's covered. And is that right? I mean, maybe for CERCIA, when it comes to information gathering, it is appropriate. But if we start using that as a guide for what entities are responsible for, maintaining a level of defense that can hold its own against a state-directed intrusion or state-directed disruption activity, that starts to become fairly murky fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems that nothing is ever prescriptive when it comes from the government related to cyber. Maybe this is one area that should be.
Potentially. Again, it's going to be difficult because we're seeing, I think, a pretty significant change, at least on the U.S. side of things, in terms of how regulation and federal guidance is going to swing when it comes to private operators of critical infrastructure. That I think we're seeing less emphasis on that sort of policy prescription. So some of the things that appear to be going forward previously, even going back to like PPD 21 stuff or whatever, I would expect that to get dialed back a little bit in the future, but we'll see how all that shakes out. But even still, these are important national security issues for, again, continuity of government, continuity of society. So something needs to try to coordinate these sorts of items and figure out, well, in a true emergency, where do scarce response and recovery resources get allocated?
Yeah. You brought up private entities around critical infrastructure. How much is that complicated? I don't know what the real percentage is of private ownership of utilities or whatever in the country. But I mean, I think it's significant. And how does that complicate things?
It complicates things significantly. And one of the things I brought up in my presentation that makes things even more interesting to discuss is that, on the one hand, some of the largest entities that are operating, like your investor-owned utilities and similar, which very large customer bases covering wide swaths of the U.S. economy, on the one hand, those seem like, well, these are the systemically important entities for ensuring continuity of the economy and resilience of the economy. But these are also entities that they have a fairly significant amount of resources. Should we expect and advocate for those organizations doing more on their own, above and beyond what they're doing presently, to shoulder more of that burden and then shift public resources to the have-nots within the space? Because there's plenty of cooperatives, municipals, local and regional hospital networks and similar that don't have the resources to respond to these events. And this gets into questions of distributive justice, which get really interesting and really thorny really fast. And it becomes fascinating to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't have a good solution for how to actually resolve it right now, other than just acknowledging that, hey, we have some disconnects here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just picturing that small water utility in the middle of Idaho that, it's not necessarily national security interest, but for that community, it's a big deal.
Right, exactly. Well, look at some recent incidents. So for some of the cyber Avengers and other sorts of events that have taken place over the last year and change in North America, who's heard of Muleshoe, Texas before a few months ago when one of their external-facing HMIs was defaced? No one. Yeah. That sort of incident really ended up being kind of a nothing item in terms of how it impacted service provision. But if you have access to the HMI, you can do worse things than just deface it. And how do we start figuring out where these things align in terms of defensive resourcing and similar become critical questions?
Yeah. Just to divert for a second, what do you make of incidents like that? Is it just kind of like a projection of power or access or something else?
I think so. It's like an intimidation tactic more so than anything else right now. Again, if you have access to the HMI, there are other things that you can do. And thankfully, like we've seen in some other events, adversaries don't really know what they can or what would be a meaningful action to take. So we're relying on adversaries to continue to be ignorant or just not very well informed for how these systems work.
Right.
We can't rely on that forever because there are far more worrisome entities, from your Volt Typhoons to your Sandworms to whomever's that are out there operating that can easily piggyback on what are, Ron Fabella gave a very interesting presentation on this at the S4 conference earlier this year of sort of advanced persistent script kiddies, basically, that are targeting these lower hanging fruit targets that are accessible and available. And on the one hand, it's nothing in terms of impact, but really emphasizes that there are systemic weaknesses in play for these sorts of organizations that could be exploited by more concerning actors.
Yeah. I had him on the podcast actually right after S4 to talk about that.
Yeah.
And like the point he made was, sure, they're script kiddies and it's not super critical kind of incident, but you have to investigate all of these. And you're, throwing away resources and the time and money and people on every incident because you have to look at them.
Yeah, exactly. And it also highlights other things too. Like, one of the points that I made in my talk is that there are degrees of response and support that can exist, and that we need to start taking a more active look at, beyond just saying information sharing, which is the thoughts and prayers of the computer security, information security, and OT security space.
Yeah.
That what does that really mean? And so looking for opportunities to advocate for and provide support for things like better attack surface management, being able to alert organizations like, hey, you are exposing this infrastructure externally that you probably are not even aware of because your integration contractor made a shortcut 5 years ago when they were setting things up and never took it down. Hey, you need to stop this because it's a significant vulnerability. Looking for those opportunities to economize on support that also can have more impactful results in terms of making these organizations more resilient and more defensible in nature.
So what do you tell an asset owner when, you're basically telling them you got to get real about being critical or not, and adapt your defenses or whatever the message is? Like, what?
Yeah, I mean,
it's a difficult conversation.
It is a difficult conversation because no one wants to be told, like, you're just not that important, buddy. I'm sorry. But at least understanding that for, like, well, what is it that we could realistically rely upon in a truly alarming situation? Is the U.S. government in some fashion going to ride in and save the day? Is, pick a private IR firm or whatever going to be available for this? And realizing that, well, if they're not, what do we do?
Right.
Becomes a important question to at first just consider. And then, like I said, looking to classic DRP, BCP scenarios to figure out, well, if we have to operate in a severely degraded fashion, can we still operate? Looking back to things like the Ukraine power incidents in the mid-2010s, they were able to restore operations pretty quick because they were able to switch to manual mode fairly rapidly in order to make sure that things recovered.
Sure.
Even looking, we're talking right now in the wake of the large outage in the Iberian Peninsula across Spain and Portugal. They were able to get operations up pretty quickly.
Yeah.
If that had been a cyber operation that included a data wiper or something as well, would they have been able to replicate that level of success? And so planning for and figuring out what are our dependencies in business restoration and service restoration, and if some of these items, whether it's the availability of computer systems, the availability of communication systems is taken away, what do we do? And not just rely on like, well, it's important or whatever at this point, someone will come and save us.
Yeah.
What does that look like if that's not the case?
Right. And I mean, and you mentioned that blackout.
Yeah.
Chances are it was a squirrel or more so than a hacker somewhere, but the impact was massive for the time of the lights were out.
Yeah, I mean, look to all of our major events across utilities, going back to 2003 with the Northeast blackout in the U.S. and the Italian sort of Southern European blackout in the EU not that much later. We're talking tree trimming, maintenance, and similar items that resulted in massive outages. And we've learned lessons from them, which, we changed the subject a little bit, but I think that's going to be one of the big so what's out of the Spain-Portugal event is identifying what are those chains of dependencies that exist that, like, okay, if not this one thing or these two things, but these 3 or 4 things happen all in sequence.
Sure.
How do we make sure that we build systemic resilience into our operations so that doesn't happen again? Because the 2003 blackout scenario in North America across the U.S. and Canada, we're pretty good for making sure that doesn't happen again. But what about other scenarios, whether it's cyber or otherwise, and really taking a informed engineering approach to how these things play out?
A lot of times it's something you haven't thought of yet.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So just to kind of get back on the topic, how important is it for policymakers to kind of either define or communicate criticality to asset owners?
Very important.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, it's probably not going to be a public communication, but it definitely needs to be something that happens.
Yeah.
There needs to be a secure, non-public, very blunt way of saying, like, hey, if things go south, here is where you align, here's what you can expect, here's what you need to do if you want to maintain efficacy and availability in a contested Volt Typhoon scenario or something similar.
And so in your talk, you describe, you go into like this concept of community defense. And does that start with the vendors kind of adapting products in any such way, or go into that a little bit?
Yeah, and we're at RSA right now, so it's an interesting place to talk about this because I've joked with people before that RSA is several hundred vendors that are all chasing the same 100 customers when it comes to the large enterprise space, because they have the most money, the most resources to spend on these sorts of things. And from a vendor perspective, I think there needs to be a greater awareness and a greater willingness to think about, like, okay, landing those big labels, those big logos or whatever, that's nice. That's how, the salespeople get their bonuses. It's how investors get warm, fuzzy feelings about where the organization is going. But that ignores that there's an awfully long tail of other organizations that can benefit from security solutions. And, we have to be realistic and admit the Cadillac solutions aren't necessarily going to be available or price competitive or whatnot for organizations that have, Yugo level budgets and so forth, to use a very aged example right now. So how can we adapt best of breed technologies into best good enough for those organizations and have a solution that is adaptable for and provides some level of defense for organizations with a lower spend?
Yeah.
It's a harder problem to answer, but figuring out ways of doing this, and maybe this comes through public-private partnerships or looking for nonprofits that can step in as organizing entities among different sectors in order to provide support or guidance for this sort of rollout. I mean, thinking about how to shift this delivery mechanism, I think, is a really important and underexplored area for where vendors can step in to really provide a meaningful and impactful way of improving the situation.
Do you think the secure buy approaches and ideas, you think those are helpful, or is it marketing?
No, secure by design, cyber-informed engineering, consequence-informed engineering, and similar approaches are very important. The question is that are these forward-looking or are these backward-looking solutions? Because for a lot of organizations that are out there, it's like, yeah, secure by design is great. I have a network that was set up 15 years ago and it needs to last another 10. Right. I can't rip and replace it all immediately right now, so what do I do? Yeah. And so we really need a blended approach for it's like, yes, I know going forward what it is that I need to do to create the successor network to what I have right now, but how do I adapt what it is that I'm, the equipment and the network I have today to face the challenges of tomorrow until I can get the solutions for the day after.
Mm-hmm. So you brought up Volt Typhoon a couple of times, and that it's a real big, scary kind of messaging around it. And it's like a new kind of aggression, it seems, from a group like that, or maybe not. But just this macro threat versus micro threat idea. Go into that a little bit in that context.
So Volt Typhoon has been very interesting in that they've been highly opportunistic in terms of operations, as far as we can tell, targeting relatively small entities and using exploits, credential brute force, and similar mechanisms to gain access to a variety of organizations that roughly align with strategic significance, but not shying away from targeting your munis and co-ops and similar entities.
Sure.
So a lot of the organizations that are facing risk from the Volt Typhoon entity are organizations that are among, below the security poverty line, to use Wendy Nather's concept from several years ago. But you piece it all together, it's like, okay, Volt Typhoon's targeting like this municipal cooperative utility in North Carolina. Well, that entity happens to serve a Marine Corps Air Force or Air Base installation or whatever, because that's where their power distribution is being routed through. It's like, oh, okay, and you aggregate that out a little bit, and it's like, oh, we're seeing a lot of these entities that happen to be near key logistics or key defense hubs and similar or whatever. Yeah. And so the macro image starts to become piecing all these items together into each individual item on its own may not be all that significant, but the picture aggregated across every intrusion becomes very concerning very quickly. And so how do I then leverage some sort of resources or coordination to address the macro issue from a bunch of very small micro impacts that build up to that larger picture?
There's a lot of work that has to go into this to piece this all together. I mean, you got to be some serious detective work going on.
Some serious detective work, but also, and I kind of made fun of it a little earlier, but a lot of information sharing, but not just sending indicators of compromise back and forth, but actually sharing information about who's targeting us, what have we seen in terms of anomalous network activity, and where is it coming from? And that's bidirectional, both on the terms of the asset owners being more willing to share with higher level authorities and aggregating entities like a CISA or like a EISAC or similar groups, but also from those groups to do a better and more effective job of sharing down as to why things are important and what to do with them. Yeah. Because quite frankly, everyone can do a better job in this space. And as we've seen this in a much more interesting threat landscape, we really need to, if we're going to be able to respond to these problems effectively.
Do you see a day where CISA or whatever the body is kind of moves away from the critical infrastructure sectors? Does the prioritization by sector make sense as opposed to impact on economic security or national security or military, whatever?
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's really going to depend upon what we as a society decide is like, to what extent do we want government, especially when it comes to the private ownership of public service provisions, that how active and how interventionist should government be in stepping in there? And I think that's an unsettled question at the moment, given a lot of changes that have taken place over the last few months, especially in the United States, certainly, but elsewhere too. As you're seeing things like new regulatory frameworks come out across the European Union as well, is that we're trying to figure this out as we move along here. Yeah. And it's an unsettled space to figure out just what those decisions are going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, this turbulence is not helping right now.
No,
you got to figure somebody's going to leverage this.
Yeah, I mean, we're very much building the ship while it's at sea at the moment, and not only while it's at sea, but while not only is the storm on the horizon, but we might be sailing into it as we speak.
I know in your talk you go into like the definition of covered entities and how that may be muddying the waters a little bit. Can you kind of describe what you worked up there?
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, is that no one wants to be wrong, no one wants to be seen as having left something out that was important. And so the concept of what's a covered entity when it comes to critical infrastructure, looking at both U.S. and European Union efforts in order to define what is a covered entity or what is a critical entity, have been almost uniformly viewed as overly broad in nature, because it's the incentivization of like, well, we don't want to miss anything, and so we'll define this in a large sense or whatever, and then we'll narrow it down later. The problem is that in doing so, we end up diluting resources and incorporating lots of various entities into this definition of criticality that we've mushroomed it to such a degree that it no longer becomes a meaningful term, because now it's including just about everything.
Everything. Yeah, exactly. And again, there comes a point where you have to be honest with the asset owners and tell them you're not important, but to the overall picture.
But it's also interesting, too, and I know this goes to some work that I've done historically, whether at the MITRE Corporation or elsewhere, of it's not just about individual entities, but again, taking that micro versus macro view of how do individual entities operating in the critical infrastructure space interact with one another in order to enable the macro delivery of a given service. So, for example, we talk about medical care as being a very important thing. It's like, well, the hospital needs electricity, right? It's like, oh, they got a generator. They can operate for 24 hours. Like, okay, that's cool. What if the electric sector gets hit, the hospital is able to operate off of backup power, but that power outage also takes out the wastewater treatment or the steam plant that hospital is relying upon. Now that hospital can't sterilize surgical equipment or do triage and similar operations within the emergency room.
A lot of dependencies, yeah.
Right, and so playing out those relationships can start revealing interesting factors where it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. To start really highlighting what are the very real pain points that may have been overlooked previously. And so developing scenarios that exercise these sorts of items. Another example, to use a different Typhoon, everyone talked about Salt Typhoon in the context of like, oh, they're going to steal my messages and capture my phone calls. They can do that. Sure. But if they have access to do that, they have access to do other things too, like turn off or disrupt a device that's routing those calls at the same time.
Right.
If we have a loss of telecoms, how does that impact the ability of a electric utility, for example, to enter into manual operations if cell phones don't work? Mm-hmm. That's going to be very difficult, and I hope you have a lot of two-way radios.
Yeah. And I guess going back to the collective defense ideas, is there something that the larger operators can do to kind of help down the line, so to speak?
Well, I mean, we already have this idea of collective response and mutual assistance and similar when it comes to like the electric sector particularly, and extending that idea in certain ways in cyber. I mean, I'm definitely not the first one to mention it, but I will be another person to bring it up. Is a interesting model. It's not necessarily a solution, but it's an interesting idea to try to adapt for these sorts of items. And are there ways that, whether it's through the ISACs, whether it's through other coalitions of entities, to do a more effective job in sharing information, expertise, and best practices among entities to up-level the entire field? Certainly sounds good. How we do that effectively, I'm not 100% sure, to be very honest with you, but exploring what those relationships look like and how they would be effectively implemented, because I think we've done a lot of hand-wavy implementations of these ideas in terms of information sharing, but not to the extent that it's been terribly effective yet.
So kind of just to wrap up, is there something ideally you'd like to see by the end of this administration or the next couple of years? Is there like a checklist of 2 or 3 things that you think should happen or could happen to really move this issue forward?
It would be very advantageous one way or another just to finally arrive at here's what we're going to do, because it's shifted back and forth. It doesn't help that we've had very different administrations shift back and forth over the last 12 years in terms of perspective. But there's been a lot of uncertainty, and we'll likely continue to see it with things like Cercia and similar, that there needs to be some level of predictability for asset owners to base their decision-making around. And so picking a solution and sticking with it, for better or for worse, and start building around that, I think would be ideal. Absent that, arriving at a very clear decision and then enforcing it relatively quickly and being able to say, like, this is what we're going to do, plan on this appropriately, here's how we're moving forward, would be nice. Because, again, it seems like there's been a lot of back and forth and uncertainty in this space that's made long-term planning very difficult, or left a lot of asset owners into like, well, I guess we're making this up as we go along.
Sure. It's a fascinating topic. I think you're going to get some people talking.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And, again, these are hard questions. If they weren't, we'd have them already solved. But at least talking about them highlights that they are things to be addressed.
Right. All right, man. Thank you so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah.